An invasive species is a plant, fungus, or animal species that is not native to a specific location, and which has a tendency to spread to a degree believed to cause damage to the environment, human economy, and human health. One study pointed out widely divergent perceptions of the criteria for invasive species among researchers and concerns with the subjectivity of the term invasive. Some of the alternate usages of the term are below. The term is most often used applies to introduced species that adversely affect the habitats and bioregions they invade economically, environmentally, or ecologically. Such invasive species may be either plants or animals and may disrupt by dominating a region, wilderness areas, particular habitats, or wildland urban interface land from loss of natural controls. This includes non-native invasive plant species labeled as exotic pest plants and invasive exotics growing in native plant communities. It has been used in this sense by government organizations as well as conservation groups such as the International Union for Conservation of Nature and the California Native Plant Society. The European Union defines invasive alien species as those that are, firstly, outside the natural distribution area, and secondly, threaten biological diversity. It is also used by land managers, botanists, researchers, horticulturalists, conservationists, and the public for noxious weeds. The kudzu vine, Andean pampas grass, and yellow star thistle are examples. An alternate usage broadens the term to include indigenous or native species along with non-native species that have colonized natural areas. Deer are an example, considered to be overpopulating the native zones and adjacent suburban gardens by some in the northeastern and Pacific coast regions of the United States. Sometimes the term is used to describe a non-native or introduced species that has become widespread. However, not every introduced species has adverse effects on the environment. A non-adverse example is the common goldfish, which is found throughout the United States, but rarely achieves high densities. Causes. Scientists include species and ecosystem factors among the mechanisms that, when combined, establish invasiveness in a newly introduced species. Species-based mechanisms. While all species compete to survive, invasive species appear to have specific traits or specific combinations of traits that allow them to outcompete a native species. In some cases, the competition is about rates of growth and reproduction. In other cases, species interact with each other more directly. Researchers disagree about the usefulness of traits as invasiveness markers. One study found that of a list of invasive and non-invasive species, 86% of the invasive species could be identified from the traits alone. Another study found invasive species tended to have only a small subset of the presumed traits and that many similar traits were found in non-invasive species, requiring other explanations. Common invasive species traits include the following: fast growth, rapid reproduction, high dispersal ability, phenotypic plasticity, tolerance of a wide range of environmental conditions, ability to live off of a wide range of food types, association with humans, prior successful invasions. Typically, an introduced species must survive at low population densities before it becomes invasive in a new location. At low population densities, it can be difficult for the introduced species to reproduce and maintain itself in a new location, so a species might reach a location multiple times before it becomes established. Repeated patterns of human movement, such as ships sailing to and from ports or cars driving up and down highways, offer repeated opportunities for establishment. An introduced species might become invasive if it can outcompete a native species for resources such as nutrients, light, physical space, water, or food. If these species evolved under great competition or predation, then the new environment may host fewer able competitors, allowing the invader to proliferate quickly. Ecosystems in which are being used to the fullest capacity by native species can be modeled as zero-sum systems in which any gain for the invader is a loss for the native. However, such unilateral competitive superiority is not the rule. Invasive species often coexist with native species for an extended time, and gradually, the superior competitive ability of an invasive species becomes apparent as its population grows larger and denser and it adapts to its new location. An invasive species might be able to use resources that were previously unavailable to native species, such as deep water sources accessed by a long taproot, or an ability to live on previously uninhabited soil types. For example, barbed goat grass was introduced to California on serpentine soils, which have low water retention, low nutrient levels, a high magnesium-calcium ratio, and possible heavy metal toxicity. Plant populations on these soils tend to show low density, but goat grass can form dense stands on these soils and crowd out native species that have adapted poorly to serpentine soils. Invasive species might alter its environment by releasing chemical compounds, modifying abiotic factors, or affecting the behavior of herbivores, creating a positive and negative impact on other species. Some species, like Kalanchoe digramentana, produce allelopathic compounds that might have an inhibitory effect on competing species. Other species, like Staplia gigantea, facilitates the recruitment of seedlings of other species in arid environments by providing appropriate microclimatic conditions and preventing herbivory in early stages of development. Another examples are Centaurea solstitialis and Centaurea diffusa. These Eastern European noxious weeds have spread through the western and west coast states. Experiments show that 8-hydroxyquinoline, a chemical produced at the root of C. diffusa, has a negative effect only on plants that have not co-evolved with it. Such co-evolved native plants have also evolved defenses. C. diffusa and C. solstitialis do not appear in the native habitats to be overwhelmingly successful competitors. Success or lack of success in one habitat does not necessarily imply success in others. Conversely, examining habitats in which a species is less successful can reveal novel weapons to defeat invasiveness. Changes in fire regimens are another form of facilitation. Bromus tectorum, originally from Eurasia, is highly fire-adapted. It not only spreads rapidly after burning but also increases the frequency and intensity of fires by providing large amounts of dry detritus during the fire season in western North America. In areas where it is widespread, it has altered the local fire regimen so much that native plants cannot survive the frequent fires, allowing B. tectorum to further extend and maintain dominance in its introduced range. Facilitation also occurs where one species physically modifies a habitat in ways that are advantageous to other species. For example, zebra mussels increase habitat complexity on lake floors, providing crevice in which invertebrates live. This increase in complexity, together with the nutrition provided by the waste products of mussel filter feeding, increases the density and diversity of benthic invertebrate communities. ecosystem-based mechanisms. In ecosystems, the amount of available resources and the extent to which those resources are used by organisms determines the effects of additional species on the ecosystem. In stable ecosystems, equilibrium exists in the use of available resources. These mechanisms describe a situation in which the ecosystem has suffered a disturbance which changes the fundamental nature of the ecosystem. When changes such as a forest fire occur, normal succession favors native grasses and forbs. An introduced species that can spread faster than natives can use resources that would have been available to native species, squeezing them out. Nitrogen and phosphorus are often the limiting factors in these situations. Every species occupies a niche in its native ecosystem. Some species fill large and varied roles, while others are highly specialized. Some invading species fill niches that are not used by native species, and they also can create new niches. An example of this type can be found within the Lamprephalus delicata species of skink. Ecosystem changes can alter species distributions. For example, edge effects describe what happens when part of an ecosystem is disturbed, as when land is cleared for agriculture. The boundary between remaining undisturbed habitat and the newly cleared land itself forms a distinct habitat, creating new winners and losers and possibly hosting species that would not thrive outside the boundary habitat. One interesting finding in studies of invasive species has shown that introduced populations have great potential for rapid adaptation, and this is used to explain how so many introduced species are able to establish and become invasive in new environments. When bottlenecks and founder effects cause a great decrease in the population size, the individuals begin to show additive variance as opposed to epistatic variance. This conversion can actually lead to increased variance in the founding populations, which then allows for rapid adaptive evolution. Following invasion events, selection may initially act on the capacity to disperse as well as physiological tolerance to the new stressor in the environment. Adaptation then proceeds to respond to the selective pressures of the new environment. These responses would most likely be due to temperature and climate change, or the presence of native species, whether it be predator or prey. Adaptations include changes in morphology, physiology, phenology, and plasticity. Rapid adaptive evolution in these species leads to offspring that have higher fitness and are better suited for their environment. Intraspecific phenotypic plasticity, pre-adaptation and post-introduction evolution are all major factors in adaptive evolution. Plasticity in populations allows room for changes to better suit the individual in its environment. This is key in adaptive evolution because the main goal is how to best be suited to the ecosystem that the species has been introduced. The ability to accomplish this as quickly as possible will lead to a population with a very high fitness. Pre-adaptations and evolution after the initial introduction also play a role in the success of the introduced species. If the species has adapted to a similar ecosystem, it contains traits that happen to be well suited to the area that it is introduced, it is more likely to fare better in the new environment. This, in addition to evolution that takes place after introduction, all determine if the species will be able to become established in the new ecosystem and if it will reproduce and thrive. Ecology. Traits of invaded ecosystems. In 1958, Charles S. Elton claimed that ecosystems with higher species diversity were less subject to invasive species because of fewer available niches. Other ecologists later pointed to highly diverse but heavily invaded ecosystems and argued that ecosystems with high species diversity were more susceptible to invasion. This debate hinged on the spatial scale at which invasion studies were performed, and the issue of how diversity affects susceptibility remained unresolved as of 2011. Small-scale studies tended to show a negative relationship between diversity and invasion, while large-scale studies tended to show the reverse. The latter result may be a side effect of invasive's ability to capitalize on increased resource availability and weaker species interactions that are more common when larger samples are considered. Invasion was more likely in ecosystems that were similar to the one in which the potential invader evolved. Island ecosystems may be more prone to invasion because the species faced few strong competitors and predators, or because the distance from colonizing species populations makes them more likely to have open niches. An example of this phenomenon was the decimation of native bird populations on Guam by the invasive brown tree snake. Conversely, invaded ecosystems may lack the natural competitors and predators that check invasive's growth in the native ecosystems. Invaded ecosystems may have experienced disturbance, typically human-induced. Such a disturbance may give invasive species a chance to establish themselves with less competition from natives less able to adapt to a disturbed ecosystem. Vectors. Non-native species have many vectors, including biogenic vectors, but most invasions are associated with human activity. Natural range extensions are common in many species, but the rate and magnitude of human-mediated extensions in these species tend to be much larger than natural extensions, and humans typically carry specimens greater distances than natural forces. An early human vector occurred when prehistoric humans introduced the Pacific route to Polynesia. Vectors include plants or seeds imported for horticulture. The pet trade moves animals across borders, where they can escape and become invasive. Organisms stow away on transport vehicles. Ballast water taken up at sea and released in port by transoceanic vessels is the largest vector for non-native aquatic species invasions. Around the world on the average day, more than 3,000 different species of aquatic life may be transported on these vessels. For example, freshwater zebra mussels, native to the Black Caspian and Azov seas, probably reached the Great Lakes via ballast water from a transoceanic vessel. Although the zebra mussel invasion was first noted in 1988, and a mitigation plan was successfully implemented shortly thereafter, the plan had a serious flaw: a loophole, whereby ships that are loaded with cargo when they reach the seaway need not be tested, but all the same they transfer ballast puddles between seaway ports. The arrival of invasive propagules to a new site is a function of the site's invasibility. Species have also been introduced intentionally. For example, to feel more at home, American colonists formed acclimation societies that repeatedly imported birds that were native to Europe to North America and other distant lands. In 2008, U.S. postal workers in Pennsylvania noticed noises coming from inside a box from Taiwan. The box contained more than 24 live beetles. Agricultural Research Service entomologists identified them as rhinoceros beetle, Hercules beetle, and king stag beetle. Because these species were not native to the U.S., they could have threatened native ecosystems. To prevent exotic species from becoming a problem in the U.S., special handling and permits are required when living materials are shipped from foreign countries. USDA programs such as smuggling interdiction and trade compliance attempt to prevent exotic species outbreaks in America. Economics plays a major role in exotic species introduction. High demand for the valuable Chinese mitten crab is one explanation for the possible intentional release of the species in foreign waters. Impacts of wildfire. Invasive species often exploit disturbances to an ecosystem to colonize an area. Large wildfires can sterilize soils, while adding a variety of nutrients. In the resulting free-for-all, a formerly entrenched species lose their advantage, leaving more room for invasives. In such circumstances, plants that can regenerate from the roots have an advantage. Non-natives with this ability can benefit from a low-intensity fire burns that removes surface vegetation, leaving natives that rely on seeds for propagation to find their niches occupied when the seeds finally sprout. Impact of wildfire suppression on spreading. Wildfires often occur in remote areas, needing fire suppression crews to travel through a pristine forest to reach the site. The crews can bring invasive seeds with them. If any of these stowaway seeds become established, a thriving colony of invasives can erupt in as few as 6 weeks, after which controlling the outbreak can need years of continued attention to prevent further spread. Also, disturbing the soil surface, such as cutting fire breaks, destroys native cover, exposes soil, and can accelerate invasions. In suburban and wildland-urban interface areas, the vegetation clearance and brush removal ordinances of municipalities for defensible space can result in excessive removal of native shrubs and perennials that exposes the soil to more light and less competition for invasive plant species. Fire suppression vehicles are often major culprits in such outbreaks, as the vehicles are often driven on back roads often overgrown with invasive plant species. The undercarriage of the vehicle becomes the prime vessel of transport. In response, on large fires, washing stations decontaminate vehicles before engaging in suppression activities. Large wildfires attract firefighters from remote places, further increasing the potential for seed transport.